Okay, so let's get started in the interest of time. We don't run over. Welcome everybody this afternoon to our yet another webinar. Those of you that have been attending will know that we've run an awful lot of them to keep you busy and out of trouble during COVID. Today we have a special guest, Joe Walden. His topic is just-in-time Six Sigma TOC, same programs with different approaches to problem solving. So industry has used the theory of constraints, Six Sigma, lean, and just-in-time as tools for inventory management, quality programs, and continuous process improvement programs for the last 3 decades. Each of these tools have produced phenomenal gains and improvement in large and small companies. The goal of this program is to show the similarities of the programs and show that they are basically the same tool with different approaches to problem solving by looking at the background of the tools and their implementation steps. So Joe joins us from the US. He has over 40 years of experience in supply chain management and logistics as a practitioner, consultant, and educator. He designed and operated a 40-hectare distribution center in Kuwait to support operations in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He currently teaches supply chain management and decision-making at the University of Kansas. Joe is certified as a CPIMF. A lot of you may not know what that is. That is the Certified in Production Inventory Management Fellow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they issue that anymore. But that's from APEX and a demonstrated master logistician by the International Society of Logistics. He is also certified in Six Sigma and Lean. So any more introduction that you'd like to add to that, Joe? I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks for being here. And yeah, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, well, good morning. In y'all's case, good afternoon. First thing I want to tell you is you may not hear anything new here today. My goal is to get you to start thinking about these different programs and how they're interrelated, because it seems like everywhere I go, there's a group of folks that are just-in-timers, and there's some TOCers, and there's some Six Sigmers, and they always want to argue with each other that they have the best program out there. I mean, I've done them all. As you said, I've got over 40 years experience, because having been around a long time, I've seen all these programs come, and some of them go and some of them come back again. So my goal today is really get you thinking about the 3 different programs and their similarities. So really, I want to kind of give you a little bit of background on me. As Tanya said, I've got over 40 years experience. I started off in the US Army, did about 26 plus years in the Army, was going to do 3 and get out and make bucks in the real world, and decided what I was doing in the supply chain logistics world was just so much fun. I didn't want to leave it. After 26 years, decided I wanted to establish some roots. Became a consultant for a while because I didn't want a real job. I wanted to discover that consulting, as Ken can tell you, consulting is a real job. And it also kept me on the road a lot. So I decided to get another job developing supply chain logistics training programs for the Army. And then for the last 10 years, I've been teaching here at the University of Kansas. A long time ago, I got an MBA with a concentration in logistics, because as some of us old guys know, supply chain is a relatively new term. And when I got my first master's degree, we didn't have that term. So it was a focus in logistics. Got 3 other master's degrees, 1 in engineering, and then got a doctorate in education with a focus on developing supply chain curriculum, trying to standardize that across the board here in the US. That's one of my biggest goals, is trying to make sure that everybody coming out of our program is prepared. They've got the right tool set to be successful in the real world. So here's my agenda for the day. I want to give you a little bit of background about the 3 different programs. I'm going to look at the steps for implementation for each one of those programs, do a crosswalk comparison of the steps, give you some final thoughts, and then have time for some questions and answers. The faded background on my slides here is a picture I took several years ago and then kind of made it a little lighter, of the Maui Sugar Company in Hawaii. And I like to use them as a great example because they didn't use any of these tools. They did business the same way for over 100 years. And we know in business, it's adapt or die. And they didn't adapt. They didn't use Six Sigma, lean, theory constraints, just in time. They didn't use any of these tools. And they couldn't understand why their operations got more and more expensive. They kept on doing things the same way over and over and over again. And really, the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing the same way and expecting different results. So all three of these programs will give you great results. But hopefully when we get through this discussion, you'll agree they're really very, very similar. First time that I came up with this idea about a decade ago, I gave a presentation similar to this in California. At the end of the presentation, guy came up after the presentation, gave me his card and said, "You're an idiot." So, well, I've heard that before. What gave you that thought today? He said, "There's no way they're the same thing." About 3 years ago, he published an article saying that you could use all three programs. They were the same thing. So I sent him a note. "Bubba, I thought I was an idiot for this idea." He goes, "You still are, because you didn't do anything with it after you came up with the idea. I realized you were right. So I've made money off your idea. Have a nice day." So I just tore his business card up and threw it away. So that's my agenda for the day. I want to start by kind of showing where I think we're going today. Hopefully I'm going to convince you that all three of the programs are basically the same. They are continuous process improvement programs. They are problem-solving programs. They are critical thinking programs. And I think, and hopefully I will convince you the same today, that they're all really based upon Stewart's plan, do, check, act cycle, or some people call it the Deming wheel. Stewart's plan, do, check, act cycle has been around almost 100 years. I think, from my experience, Six Sigma, just-in-time, theory constraints are really adaptations of Stewart's plan, do, check, act cycle. So let's get into the meat of it. Here's Stewart's cycle. You identify a problem. You come up with a plan to fix it. You check the plan. Did the plan work right? If it worked right, then you implement the plan and then you go back and start again. Continuous process improvement. I think I'm at least going to try to convince you that all three of these programs share their lineage back to this plan, do, check, act cycle. So it's just in time. Okay? And we all know the background. It came to us from Toyota, the writings of Ono and Shingo and the Toyota production system, which really traces its roots back to Dr. Deming, who went to Japan after World War II and helped them rebuild their economy. So a lot of what we attribute to just in time and lean really go back to the teachings of Dr. Deming. And oh, by the way, Dr. Deming was a disciple of Stewart. So at least the foundation for what we call just in time can trace its lineage and its DNA back to Stewart through Deming. The goals of just in time is eliminate waste, increase quality. And we've all seen the 7 wastes. We'll talk about those in just a second. Improve the profitability. Well, if I get rid of waste, I've impacted profitability right off the bat. For just adding cost, but not adding value. And one of the basics of all three of these programs is every step adds cost. Not every step adds value. I think that's important to keep in mind. And then reduce cost. Because if I get rid of the waste, I get rid of those costs that I had associated with the waste. I got Womack here because in 1995, James Womack wrote a book called Lean Thinking. It was a follow-on to his bestseller, The Machine That Changed the World, which was really not a machine, but about the Toyota production system. He followed it up. He got enamored with the system, as so many of us have. He got enamored with it, and he wrote Lean Thinking, which came out in 95. And my boss at the time said, "Here, you've got to read this before you start working for me." Well, okay, I'll read it then. Turns out that lean thinking was just literally a literal translation of Ono's work. And when Ono wrote about what we call just in time, Ono called it lean. Lean has the exact same 7 wastes. It's got the exact same 4 goals there. It's the same thing. Lean thinking, which started the entire lean movement, is really just a little translation of Ono's work that gave us just in time. Now then, since we can trace our lineage back to APIX and now the ASTM, in the mid 80s, actually in 1983, APIX came up with this series of papers called the Zero Inventory Papers and Zero Inventory Seminar Proceedings. They've got some great ideas here, but they missed the point there because all they focused on was the idea of the waste of inventory. And there's more to just in time than just inventory management. In fact, I got to tell you, from my experience, military and commercial world, practitioner as well as consultant, I've got a lot of issues with just in time as an inventory methodology. And in fact, here in the States, we expose those flaws of just in time as inventory methodology with all the pandemic buying and the panic buying tied to the pandemic in March, April, and May, and all the shelves were empty. So I have issues with just in time as a inventory methodology. As a continuous process improvement methodology, I'm a big fan of it. So here's the wastes. The waste of overproduction, which is really tied to the 4th one there, the waste of stocks. If I make too much, more than I need, it goes on the shelf and nobody buys it. And I just had a discussion with my class this morning about productivity. And I told them one of the things that I think is tied into productivity is the fact that somebody's buying what I'm making. Because if I'm making it, putting it on the shelf, nobody buys it, I'm not making money. I don't make money, I'm not in business very long. So those 2 wastes are very closely related. The waste of waiting. We've all experienced that. Waiting in a traffic jam, waiting in line at the store, waiting in line at an amusement park, waiting for the truck to show up at the distribution center, waiting for the truck to show up at the manufacturing facility. Waiting between operations. There's no value added there in waiting. The waste of transportation. And this really contributes a lot to our reverse logistics problem, where we put stuff on a truck, we ship it somewhere because we think they need it. It gets there, they don't sell it, now we got to bring it back. Waste of transportation. The waste of motion, moving stuff for the sake of moving it. And the beauty of RFID tags. Now, I was in Kuwait a few years back now. We had the old style RFID tags about the size of my coffee cup. But when they're attached to a pallet and you're watching these things move around the yard at the distribution center, you wonder why they're moving. It gives the illusion of progress, but there's no value added moving stuff around. And just in time and lean tell us the movement of 1 inch is still a movement. Does it add value? If it doesn't add value, why do it? The waste of making defects. I'm sure I'm not the only one here this morning who's been associated with companies who there's not time to do it right, but there's always time to go back and redo it. There's no value added there. And the waste of processing, doing processes that don't need to be done. Again, back to my earlier statement, every process in business adds cost. Not every process adds value. If it doesn't add value to the customer experience, to the quality of the product, or bottom line profits, I've really got to wonder, why are we doing it? And again, the same 7 wastes that we see in just in time, when lean thinking came out, Womack called them Muda, and he had the exact same 7 Mudas. Muda, when you translate it from Japanese to English, is waste. So at least from my simple way of thinking, just in time and lean are exactly the same thing because they have the same goals and the exact same 7 wastes. Now they've got some more tools. Both of them focus on the idea of Kaizen. Great book here called The Spirit of Kaizen by Robert Maurer. It's a relatively thin book. I've read it a couple of times now. Every time I read it, I find something new in it. Highly recommend it. Robert Maurer, The Spirit of Kaizen. There we go, this side. Really good book. You can pick it up on Amazon. You can pick it up on eBay, relatively cheap as a used copy. And it's got some great stuff about Kaizen, which I think is a great tool of just-in-time and lean. Here are the implementation steps of just-in-time. Document the current process. Well, that sounds like the thing I tell all my students all the time. You've got to physically walk the process to see what's going on. It's kind of like when Covey wrote his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of his habits is seek first to understand and then be understood. Same thing. You walk the process. You ask, what are we doing? Why are we doing it that way? Is there a better way to do it? Which really is step 2 there. Determine the reasons for the variations. Why are we doing what we're doing? Is it adding value or not? And if it doesn't add value, why are we doing it? Then we implement the change. And then we mistake-proof the change. Also called in the just-in-time lean Six Sigma world, poke-yoke, mistake-proof it. I call it idiot-proofing it, so it can't be screwed up. And then we go back to step 1. Looks an awful lot like plan, do, check, act, start again. Very similar to Stewart's plan, do, check, act cycle. So let's look at Six Sigma. Six Sigma came to us in the 80s from Motorola. When Motorola came up with this idea, I had the great fortune, the same boss that made me read Lean Thinking, made me go to Six Sigma training at Six Sigma University out in Arizona. They don't offer that anymore, so I feel very fortunate that I was able to do that, because now it's only for people that work for Motorola. This boss I had made me do a lot of things that didn't make sense to me that turned out to be the best boss I ever had. More professional development at 2 years. So I got to go to Six Sigma training out at Motorola University. And it turns out when they first started Six Sigma at Motorola, they didn't call it Six Sigma. It's called Six Sigma because it works out to be 6 standard deviations from the mean, and little sigma being the symbol for standard deviation in the statistics world. They called it their 7 nines program. They were trying to get to 99.99999% quality. 7 nines. Works out again to basically, when you plot it out, about 6 standard deviations from the mean, and works out to about roughly 3.2 defects per million things that you do. And that ain't bad. That's not bad at all. But Six Sigma really got its publicity and really got its jumpstart from its implementation at General Electric. Jack Welch was CEO of General Electric, and I got to hear him speak at a conference a couple of years ago. Very dynamic guy. And obviously I got him here before he passed away a couple of years ago, so it's been a few years now. But when Jack was CEO of General Electric, he read about what was happening at Motorola. In fact, Motorola, when I went out there, had a chart. They could show on a chart where they focused on Six Sigma and how profitable they were when they got away from it, when they came back to it, which led to the question, if you can pinpoint how well you did doing Six Sigma, why would you ever get away from it? And the answer was, and I thought I knew the answer and I was correct. The answer was, for those of you who are in business in the 80s, and that's only a few of us on this video here, the answer was the 80s was kind of like the decade of continuous process improvement methodologies, new quality programs. Every year something new came along. And when it came along, they tried it. And it didn't work as well as Six Sigma. They went back to Six Sigma. So Jack Welch said, it's working great at Motorola. We should do it here at GE. In fact, I think it's going to work so well at GE, we can implement it not only in our manufacturing plants, we can implement it in our service aspect as well, like the GE Commercial Credit Corporation. We can reduce variability, improve quality. First time he said that, people were kind of getting tired of all these changes in quality programs, continuous process improvement programs. They drug their feet. Next year, Jack says, we're doing Six Sigma. They just kind of drug their feet. The next year, Jack came out and said, look, here's the deal. I'm tying 40% of your bonus to successful implementation of Six Sigma. Well, some of those bubbas at GE back in the 80s were making 6- and 7-figure bonuses. He got their attention quick when 40% is tied to successful implementation. He found out what was important to them and hit them where it counted. And he was right. It worked very well in manufacturing as well as in the service sector of GE. The goals of Six Sigma are to reduce variability, improve quality. Well, we just heard that piece, improve quality, with just-in-time a while ago. Reduce costs. We saw that with just-in-time. Increase profitability. If I reduce that variability, I get rid of the defects. I get rid of that excess inventory that comes from that bullwhip effect, from the variability of information. I'm more profitable. We saw those same goals in just-in-time. So here's the 5 pieces of Six Sigma. Define the process, measure the process, analyze the process, improve it, and then control it. Now, when I was at Motorola, they said that first step, defining the process, also includes we need to define who the customer is. Sounds almost common sense. Right next to Kansas, here in the middle of the U.S., is Missouri. One of the most famous men from Missouri, Mark Twain, said, "I have discovered common sense to be the least common of all the senses." So I think it's important to point out there that we need to define the customer. And they also said that first step of defining the process, besides defining the customer, includes defining what the customer wants and define it how we can do it better than the competition. Wow. If we all did those 3 steps all the time, how much more profitable would we be? How much bigger market share would we have if we took the time to do that on a regular basis? Define the customer, define what the customer wants, define how we can do it better than the competition. The second step is to measure the process. Now, to measure the process, I've got to physically walk the process. I've got to document the process. Process map, process chart, flow chart, whatever you're comfortable with. Me personally, I like process maps because, again, back to that one boss I had that was so good, that made me do things outside of my comfort area, that made me learn about Six Sigma and just-in-time. He was a big fan of process maps, and he took great care to teach me how to develop a process map. So I'm a big fan of process maps. But I will tell you, same thing I tell my students is, pick that tool that you can explain the easiest and that your bosses understand. Because I don't care how well you like process maps. If your boss likes flow charts, you need to show him a flow chart or show her a flow chart. But you document what you're doing. What are we doing? How long is it taking? What's involved with it? And then step 3 is we analyze that. We look for variability. We look for waste. What are the non-value added steps in the process that we can get rid of? And step 4, we improve the process. We implement the change. Actually, all 3 of these programs talk about implementing change. And I really think we need to talk about implementing improvement. And this is just my theory, for what it's worth. Every change is not necessarily improvement, but every improvement is a change. I want improvement. Too often, and I know a lot of us can relate to this, too often what we see is change for the sake of changing. Not improvement, but change. So I want to improve the process. I want to redesign it to get rid of the waste. Then I want to control it, which is a fancy way of saying I want to institutionalize it. So we're all doing it the same way. Then I go back to step 1 and start again. It sounds an awful lot like plan, define the process, plan the process, measure the process. That's part of the planning part of plan, do, check, act. Analyze, do. That's that analyze, and improve piece. Check, did it work? Analyze that new improvement to make sure it works. And then the plan, do, check, and then the act piece is I want to implement that for everybody and start again. So the Six Sigma looks, at least to me, from my perspective, looks a lot like the plan, do, check, act cycle in 5 steps instead of 4. Let's look at theory of constraints. Now, y'all are very lucky in South Africa, because you've got one of the world's premier experts on theory of constraints, Dr. Bernard, right there in South Africa. A genius. If you've never heard the guy speak, if you have a chance to hear him speak, do it. Every time I hear Alan speak, I'm amazed. One of the smartest people I've come across in the industry. So if you have questions on theory of constraints, or you want to hear more about theory of constraints, find Dr. Alan Bernard and listen to what he's got to say. Genius of an individual. So here's the basics of theory of constraints. It came to us about 1984. Dr. Ellie Goldratt wrote a book called The Goal. Excellent book. You see, it's not very thick. It's, in fact, it's only, I don't know, 350 pages, but it's big print. It's double spaced. It's an easy read. It's a business novel. When Dr. Goldratt wrote this, he called it the process of ongoing improvement. Now, in The Goal, if you haven't read it, let me give you a quick synopsis. In The Goal, basically what he does is he takes everyday things in life and relates them to what's going on in the plant and the distribution center to make the points make more sense. I've read the book probably, I don't know, 6, maybe 7 times in the last 20 years. I read it every couple of years, but every time I read it, I find something new in the book. Something else jumps out at me. It's a common sense approach. But basically, the theory of constraints says every system has a bottleneck or a constraint. The capacity of the system is the capacity at the bottleneck. So, for example, the classroom I was just in, before we had our discussions here, the sign on the door says capacity 355 people per the fire marshal. Now with COVID, I'm down to a capacity of 60 people for the safety of COVID. However, prior to COVID-19, I can't do it now because I'll get fired, but prior to COVID-19, I'm convinced I could fit like 600 people in that auditorium. But the constraint, that 355 constraint there, is based upon the 2 doors they've got to exit the room safely. So the only way I can increase the capacity of a system is increase the capacity at the bottleneck or the constraint. It's kind of like my coffee cup here. My coffee cup, according to the bottom, says it holds 16 ounces. But the opening at the top here is a constraint. Only way I get more coffee out is take the lid off so I can get more coffee out. Problem is then I've got too much throughput capacity and most of it will be on my shirt. But the theory of constraints says every system has a bottleneck or constraint. So it's got a different approach than saying every system has got 7 wastes, or every system, we can look at the DMAIC concept. But here are the goals. Here are the goals of theory of constraints. And in my bookshelf over here, I've got 2, 3, 4, I got 5 different books by Dr. Goldratt. And I had the pleasure, probably about 15 years ago, to meet Dr. Goldratt at one of the APEX international conferences. Dynamic, charismatic individual. Talking to him, listening to him talk, you can only get excited about the theory of constraints. And it came to us about the same time that Six Sigma came to us. Dr. Goldratt in Israel, not even a supply chain person, which is what I find amazing. He's a physicist. But yet this is like the standard now in the supply chain world because it's a common sense approach. But we got theory of constraints from Dr. Goldratt, 1984-85 timeframe. We got Six Sigma from Motorola, about the same time frame, about 12,000 miles apart from each other. excuse me, look at the goals here. Reduce variability. Didn't we just see that a while ago with Six Sigma? Increase throughput. That's a little different. I want to get more stuff through my system. So I want to eliminate the constraint and get more throughput. But when I get more throughput, now I decrease my work in process inventory. When I decrease my work in process inventory, as we saw with Six Sigma, I increase my profits. I make more money. Dr. Goldratt was so sure of his program in the theory of constraints that for about the last decade he was alive, he had a money back guarantee. He would come into your operations. Now, he wasn't cheap. He would come into your operations and he would turn your current gross profits into your net profits. He would help you make more money. The goals, okay, is to, or the process there is to determine what we're doing, determine what needs to be fixed, what do I fix it to, and how to make the fix stick across the board. So here's the steps. Okay. Decide on the goal. That's a great way to start. Let's decide what the goal of the system really is. What are we trying to do? That's, you know what? From a common sense approach, that should be my goal for anything that I do. I want to start with what is the goal of the operation? When I teach project management to my students, I tell them the first thing we got to do is figure out what the goal is. What are we trying to accomplish with the project? But that sounds an awful lot like define the system. Step number 2, determine the performance measures. That sounds a lot like what we saw with Six Sigma. Measure the process. Step 3 is almost the exact same thing. Identify the constraints. That comes from analysis of what we measured. Step 4, we got to decide how to exploit the system constraints or get rid of the constraint altogether. How do we increase the capacity at the constraint? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve the system. Step 5, subordinate everything else to the system constraint and elevate the constraint. We want to control the system. We want to institutionalize across the entire operation the improvements we made in this part of the system. Let me go back to steps 2 and 3 and we start again. Continuous improvement. Again, if the foundation for theory of constraints is indeed Stewart's plan, do, check, act cycle, we're looking at 5 steps again for the 4 steps of plan, do, check, act. So here's the common threads that I think are the goals of all 3 programs, which I think link these programs together. All 3 of them look at increasing profitability. And let's be honest. I don't care what tool you use in business. One of your goals should always be improve my profitability. Most of the textbooks that are offered to me to use to teach operations management tell us that the goal of companies is to provide goods and services that people by themselves can't do. Well, that sounds very humanitarian. I know when I started my own consulting company, my goal was to make money. Now I made money by helping companies improve their operation, but my goal was to make money. Because if it's my company, I want to eat. I got a bad habit. I like to eat. So I want to make more money. So that should be my goal regardless of what tool I choose. Reduce variability. Well, that really all has its foundations in supply chain world in the bullwhip effect, right? We have that bullwhip effect that we don't pass good information. We have all this variability. And the more variability I've got, the more inventory I've got to stock. The more inventory I've got to stock, the less money I make. I want to improve quality. Again, I don't care whether you use just in time or lean or Six Sigma or theory of constraints. In addition to my goal being make more money, my goal should always be to improve the quality. My theory is what adds value to an organization is improving the customer experience, improving the quality of the product, and improving the bottom line profits. Not really an original thought of mine, but I took it from these 3 programs here. I want to eliminate waste. I mean, that's the number one goal of just-in-time and lean. Eliminate waste. Again, back to the idea, every process adds value. Excuse me, every process adds cost. Not every process adds value. If it doesn't add value, why are we doing it? Because if it doesn't add value, it's waste. And I want to reduce my inventory levels, primarily through reducing the non-value added steps and reducing the variability. If I do those, I'm going to be successful in my business. So let's look at the steps here. I know it's kind of a busy slide here. Okay, let's look at the steps. So if we look at just-in-time first, compared to Six Sigma theory of constraints, so we'll look at Six Sigma compared to theory of constraints. Just-in-time, the first step is I want to document the process. I want to define the process. That's exactly the first step of Six Sigma. Define the process, define the system, define the customers. Second step, determine the measures or reasons for variations. Well, the second step of Six Sigma is to measure the process. And the third step is analyze. So I'm doing really steps 2 and 3 of Six Sigma, measuring and analyze in that second step of just-in-time. Determine and measure the reasons for variations. It's the same thing as measure the process, analyze the process. Implement the change. Now, again, that's the just-in-time term. I really personally think it should say implement the improvement. Back to that idea, every improvement is a change. Not every change is an improvement. Step 4, mistake proof it. Poke yoke, idiot proof it, which is the same thing as control the process, institutionalize the improvement. And go back to step 1, continuous process improvement. When we look at Six Sigma compared to the theory of constraints, what do we see? Define the process, define the goal of the system. Define the common word there between all 3 programs. Measure the process. Well, look at the second step of theory of constraints. Determine the performance measures. Determining the measures without measuring them is of no value. Well, here's our measures here. Well, are you measuring those? No, but they look good on the PowerPoint slide. So if I want to be successful, I've got to measure those. Same 2 second steps. Step 3, analyze the process. Well, I've got to analyze the process to identify the constraints. And the important thing here between all 3 programs is to do these properly, I've got to physically walk the process. Some problems in business I can analyze from my computer screen. But just because it's in a spreadsheet, just because it's on a PowerPoint slide, doesn't make it the gospel, doesn't make it the truth. I want to know, where does it come from? So I want to walk the process so I know what is behind the numbers, not just the spreadsheet itself. Anybody can develop a spreadsheet. The key is knowing what it means. And the best way to know what it means is to physically walk the process. Step 4 of Six Sigma, improve the process. Steps 4 and 5 of the theory of constraints is improve the operation. Get rid of the constraint or increase the capacity at the constraint. The last step, control or institutionalize the change or the improvement. Elevate the constraint, institutionalize it so we're all doing it the same way. And the last step, return to the step 1. Continuous improvement. All very, very similar here in nature. Look at the goals. Eliminate waste, eliminate waste. Reduce cost, reduce cost, reduce cost. Improve quality, it's across the board in all of them. Improve profitability, it's in all 3 of them. They've got the same basic steps, different terms. I think that's just semantics. Same basic steps. They got the same basic goals. They have the same basic lineage back to Dr. Deming and then back to Dr. Schuett's plan, do, check, act cycle. 3 great programs. 3 very, very good programs. All 3 of them produce great results when properly implemented. All 3 of them are continuous process improvement programs. All 3 of them have very similar steps. They use different verbiage for the same thing. All 3 of them have very similar common goals. If they have the same steps, they have the same lineage, they have the same goals, at least in my simple mind, they're the same thing. Great tools. I don't care which one you use. All 3 of them work very well. What I want you to think about from a critical thinking perspective is, I want to get you thinking about how they're similar in nature. So when your buddy at a different plant is using Six Sigma and you're using just-in-time or lean, it's a great discussion over a beer, but it's not worth arguing about because they have the same common threads working through all 3 of them. Hopefully, I've made a great case for you this morning that they're the same thing. Hopefully, I'm getting you thinking. Hopefully, as supply chain professionals, I didn't tell you anything new today. I just gave it to you in a different and a new perspective. That they're the same thing, the same goals, the same basic steps, the same basic outputs and results. Whichever one you use, pick one that you like. Pick the tool that you're most comfortable with, or pick the tool that your boss is the most comfortable with. Because you may go to another company and your boss goes, well, we do just in time here. And you did theory constraints at your last place. Nothing new. You just change the terminology and you're ready to start implementing. So what I want to do now is open up for questions. Hopefully you got some questions. I've spurred some thought processes here. Do we have any questions out there?
Hello, Joe. It's Gamo here in South Africa. Thanks. This was brilliant. And yeah, I am in pharmaceutical warehousing and distribution. Everything you said, you're very right, is everything we experience on a daily basis. And for me, what would be your advice in pharmaceuticals where you have a department for quality and compliance? And yes, it's quality and compliance for supply chain. Then you've got operations department. And how best can we bring all this together? Because this is department running on its own, department B running on its own. And the goal is one, is to improve processes. And what can you say as someone who is in my position in quality? How can I be of value of bringing all these departments together?
I think just start the discussion with them. I mean, maybe you want to do is just take my 3 different slides there, the 3 programs, and put them on your wall. So when they come in, they say, oh, they are kind of similar. And you've addressed a very big problem that I've seen in several, actually a lot of companies, is that the operations part of the company does one of these programs and the quality does another program.
Yeah.
And even worse, within the quality world, my experience is you got half the folks who swear that just in time is a tool of lean, and the other half swear that lean is a tool of just in time. And when I get them talking, they realize, oh, wow, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just different verbiage. If nothing else, maybe knowing that they're all really basically the same, when one of them talks about one, you can translate it into the other one, saying, well, that's the same thing as this, and this in the other program.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I think what I pick up is to make it feasible and as quality also to get the other team members or stakeholders understand that you also about improvement, because mostly when you're in quality, it's like you blocking progress or improvement. So like we're saying, just put up a slide in your office or in the focus room or meeting room. Yeah, I think for them to understand that you also,
Yeah, and here's the key with quality that I try to get through to all my students is that everybody who works on the product, from the sourcing
Mm,
of raw materials to the
mm.
delivery of the product to the customer, is part of the quality team.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Oh, it shouldn't be a department actually, but yeah. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
I have another question here. Thanks, Gamu. Given the costs of implementation, especially training, which one would you recommend to anyone who starts with a clean paper?
You know, I'm a big fan of Six Sigma. It does it to get a certification. Six Sigma requires a lot of training and a lot of studying and a lot of understanding of mathematical models. But the simplicity of it, I think the steps are a little better defined in that walking the process, documenting the process, analyzing the process. I think the one thing that Six Sigma does better than the other two, from a just from a semantics perspective, is I think it makes the steps make more sense logically. It's more of a common sense labeling of the steps. So I would say if you got to pick one, pick Six Sigma, because there's more written about it, and I think there's less confusion out there in the world about Six Sigma compared to just in time versus lean, even though I think they're the same thing as well.
Thank you, Joe. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, very quiet this afternoon, everybody.
Hi, sorry, I didn't see my mic there, but Lisa here. I actually just spoke to Elaine this afternoon. It was a very unplanned call, and it just so happened that this webinar is taking place. And I was doing just a little bit of research around what Joe just spoke about, and this has essentially, or will essentially help me in figuring out what would work for our environment. So just a bit of context, Joe. I'm in the supply chain and logistics space at Woolworths, and I've been tasked to see or almost do some research in terms of what would work in our space. Because I mean, like I said, I'm in the distribution center space, so we don't necessarily manufacture products, but we get them from the supplier and start distributing them to the stores. So I like the question that Gamu also asked, because that would have been something similar that I also asked in terms of which one is more appropriate for our environment. And essentially also, if you do take a line manager through that sort of development, how do you get them to cascade it to their teams as well? Because you do not want the skill to only remain with the line manager.
No, and it's really I think the foundation of all of them is the idea of walking the process and documenting what's going on. And that's an easy piece to teach anybody. And you can do it, actually, that's really a no cost approach, because it costs you nothing to walk through your distribution center and say, okay, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing it this way?
Well, sorry to cut you, it costs so much to get people to walk, the Gemba walks, the flow walks, to get everyone to come together and value that time. Wow.
Yeah, but if you do a quick process walk and identify some of the non-value added steps and show them look, this costs us nothing to document the process, and we can modify this or get rid of this altogether, and it's going to immediately give us impact to the bottom line. People start piling onto the program. Oh, really? And we went through one distribution center and said, look, your fastest moving stuff is the farthest away from the dock. Why? And the facility manager's like, wow, I don't know. I never thought about that. It took half a day to move the fast moving stuff from the back of the facility to the front of the facility, and their reaction time was phenomenal. Or in another facility, we walked through and said, why do you have this stuff? I mean, this stuff's got like 3 inches of dust on top of it. When was the last time you sold one of these? Well, I don't know. Well, it's taking up a big chunk of your distribution center and you're not selling it. In fact, my guess is it's got so much dust on it, it's probably obsolete. And in fact, it was. So when you show them, look, we don't need this space, or we can stock something else here at no additional cost. When people start seeing the little pieces there, which is kind of really the idea of Kaizen. When they see the small changes, they get excited about it, and the small changes start snowballing into bigger changes. So I think it's the beauty across all three of them is when you can show them a small change that costs nothing. All of a sudden then the bosses get excited because, oh, wait a minute, we can do this without costing money? Well, let's do it then.
Yes, Joe, you're right. I think the quick wins are very good, especially when the guys can see what a big improvement such a small effort can make. So those quick wins, I think they help out when you can start identifying them, implement them quickly, and then move over to the big stuff that's going to take a chunk of the time. But I do believe that the Gemba walk is very critical. You know, every manager, every line manager, everyone working in this kind of environment should ideally be on the floor, seeing what's happening, where the action is going on, where the problems are occurring, because that's where your solutions are gonna come from. They're not gonna come from sitting in the office.
You know, I think you just hit the most important point that I try to get through to companies all the time. The supervisors, the managers, the leadership have to be out on the shop floor. I don't care if you're manufacturing, whether distribution center, whether you're a retail operation, the leadership has to be on the floor so they know what's going on.
Joe, thanks very much for your presentation this afternoon. I've never really thought about them being that similar, all three. What I usually tell my students is that if you're focusing on one and not thinking about the others, there are some differences, I believe, in the different methodologies. That it's a bit like they're just tools in our supply chain toolbox for continuous improvement. And if you're just focusing on TOC, for example, you're like a carpenter with just a hammer in your toolbox. You're not going to be a very good carpenter with just one tool. So I try and stress on people that they need to learn all these tools. And the very first one I like to start working on is, I don't know, Joe, have you used this book, Learning to See by Mike Rother? Value stream mapping. Value stream mapping. It's fantastic because you can't do anything. You can't change anything until you've mapped your process and you can see where the problems are. And then once you've seen the problems, you can start then applying the tools, either TOC or Six Sigma or Lean to start improving the process. That's a fantastic book, Learning to See by Mike Rother. It's a great how-to book on value stream mapping. And I've used this quite successfully in quite a few companies. But yeah, I think it was interesting listening to you and seeing the similarities. But as I say, I think there are also some differences between them, and you need to know them all. And you need to know when to use them and how to use them in your particular supply chain. Thanks.
Somebody else have a question. A few people had their mics on. No more questions. Okay. Joe, huge thank you from SAPEX for hosting
Jenny,
this.
if I can, let me give you just some final thoughts, kind of
Yes.
feed into what's going on. Whatever tool you pick, the three things you really need to think about every single day is your own personal health. Now, obviously, that's gotten more important in the last 6 months. Your own personal happiness. Don't let anybody impact your happiness. Don't give them that power over your life. Only you can decide what makes you happy and if you're gonna be happy or not. And always look for somebody for inspiration. Find somebody out there that's doing things right and let them inspire you to do great things. And here's a couple of things that I recommend for reading. The Goal, as I showed you earlier from Dr. Goldratt, if you haven't read it, read it. Get a copy and read it. And then the other book I mentioned, The Spirit of Kaizen, great book. Talks really about, as we mentioned a while ago, these small victories, the low-hanging fruit. Find the small stuff, the little victories, let them multiply into big victories. Thank you for your time. Tanya, great to see you. Jenny, great to see you as always.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for those last points finishing off. I think aside from a great presentation, those points right now where we are with all this COVID fatigue and all the chaos that's going on in the rest of the world, it's the small things that we need to think about, like our mental health, our physical health, our well-being, you know, getting inspiration, those sorts of things. So I think that everybody must take that on board. Thoroughly enjoyed presentation. I think that everybody's got something to take away from this today. So thank you so much for your time. A big thank you from SAPIX, and hopefully we can convince you to come back again in the near future and talk to us again about some more.
I'm looking forward to coming back. Thank you for letting me do this today.
I think Gucci agreed with you there, Tonya. Could hear her amplifying our exact thoughts. I've just posted a thing in the comments, Joe, that it's been way too long. And for me, it's been such a privilege to actually be able to sit and listen to you speak. I now know why you've been such a popular speaker in the SAPIX audiences and why you've been the recipient of so many awards. So from my point of view, thank you so much for sticking by us over all these years, and look forward to the next time.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
Tonya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.
Everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
You too. You must take care for sure. We don't want the second wave of COVID, please.
No.
Okay.
Don't you worry, Gamu.
Good.